Every farmer paid $800 to clear their rocks. He sold his for $12,000 to a local builder. March of 1987 came cold and stayed cold through the second week. The thaw, when it arrived fast. Gene Harmon was standing at his kitchen window on March 17th, looking east across the field when he saw it. The rocks were back. He was 61 years old, had been farming this ground in Berks County, Pennsylvania, since his father handed it to him in 1959. 28 years on the same land. He knew the rocks the way a man knows a recurring debt, not fondly, but precisely. He knew roughly how many would surface each spring, and roughly where on the field they'd appear. The frost went deep through those Pennsylvania winters, sometimes 6 feet into the ground, sometimes 7 in a bad year. When it pulled back in March, it lifted whatever it had been holding. Every year the same result. Walk the field, count the stones, decide what to do about them. The east field ran 40 acres. It started just past the equipment shed and dropped gently toward the tree line near Weiss Creek. Good ground, limestone-rich subsoil, strong water retention through the dry spells that came in July and August. But rocky. It had always been rocky. Pennsylvania schist and granite, tumbled smooth by glacial water, deposited across the county floor and buried slowly under centuries of topsoil. The frost returned them to the surface 1 or 2 inches at a time, every winter, without fail. Gene's father had dealt with them. Gene had dealt with them. The east field had never been fully clear, and, in his estimation, never would be. That March, the field was worse than he'd seen in years. The previous winter had been the coldest since 1977. The frost had gone in deep and come back slow, and what it left behind when the surface finally dried enough to walk was 40 acres that looked, from the county road, more like a dry stream than a growing plot. Stones scattered across gray mud, some no bigger than a man's fist, some that a man alone couldn't budge. Gene pulled on his rubber boots, green ones he'd bought at Agway in Kutztown the previous October, and walked the field the morning after the thaw. The ground sank 2 inches with each step, cold mud pulling at his heels with a low sucking sound. The air carried the smell of overturned earth and the faint rot of last season's cornstalks still breaking down in the low spots. He counted only the large stones, the ones that would need the loader or a pry bar and 2 men to shift. He walked in long rows, east to west, from the shed lane down to the tree line near Weiss Creek. It took 2 hours. When he came back to the house, he sat at the kitchen table and wrote the number on a yellow legal pad. 140 large stones. East Field. March 1987. He set the pad on the corner of the table next to the salt shaker and went to make coffee. The answer, in Berks County in 1987, was a man named Lloyd Metzger. Lloyd ran Metzger Excavating out of Maxatawny Township, 7 miles north of Kutztown on Route 737. He had a front-end loader, a Mack flatbed with a crane arm, and a 10-acre spread outside of town where he tipped the loads. He charged $800 per haul. He'd been clearing rocky farm ground in the county since 1972. His phone number was on a card at the Agway counter in Kutztown, tacked to the bulletin board at the grain elevator on Route 737, and printed in the co-op directory that went out every January. Gene had used Lloyd 3 times in the previous 7 years. $800 each time. The stones left his property and went to Lloyd's spread, stacked in rows next to older loads, and that was the end of them. Every farmer in that part of Berks County with rocky ground did the same. There was no other arrangement that made sense. You couldn't leave the stones in the field. Equipment would contact them. Rocks shallow enough to be lifted by frost were shallow enough to catch a disc blade or a planter tine. So you called Lloyd You paid $800 per haul, and you planted. Gene drove to the co-op that same week for seed corn. He talked to 3 neighboring farmers in the parking lot beside the loading dock. 2 had already called Lloyd. 1 was calling him that afternoon. Walt Dressel, who farmed 65 acres on the far side of Weiss Creek, said the previous winter had been hard on his north field. Said he'd had Lloyd out twice already that spring, $1,600 spent, and still had stones sitting in the far corners. Gene drove back without calling anyone. He stood in the east field that afternoon for 20 minutes with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the field the way he'd looked at a lot of problems over the years, without rushing toward a solution. The largest stone was near the center of the field, an oblong block of gray granite that had come up at an angle, its flat face tilted toward the south. It stood about 14 inches above the surface. He guessed it at 300 pounds, maybe 330. The layering in the rock showed clearly in the afternoon light, parallel striations of gray and rust running along the flat face, the color of old iron and river clay mixed together. He went back to the house and wrote nothing else on the yellow legal pad. Not that night. 4 days later, he was driving south on Route 100 when he slowed behind a cement truck making a wide turn into a construction site on the west side of the road. A house going up on a cleared lot. New framing going in, smell of cut lumber carrying across the road. He watched from behind the truck for a moment, waiting for the road to clear, and noticed the stonework. A crew of 3 men was laying Pennsylvania fieldstone on the lower face of the foundation and across the front of a low retaining wall by the drive. The stone was gray and rust-colored schist and granite, the same material sitting in his east field in 140 separate pieces. He drove past without stopping. But he thought about it for 3 days. He went back to the site on a Thursday morning. The crew was there. He found the man running the job. His name was Dale Kraft. His father, Wendell, owned the company, Kraft Stone and Masonry, based in Fleetwood. Dale told Gene they sourced their stone from a quarry in Chester County. Said the quarry charged $68 per ton at the pit. Landed on the job site, it ran $82 to $90 per ton after trucking. Gene asked whether local fieldstone would lay the same way. Dale said it depended on the piece. Flat-faced material laid cleanly and quickly. Round river tumbled stone needed more mortar and took longer to achieve a good face. He said most farmers with rocky ground just paid to have the stones hauled away. Said most of them didn't know it had value or didn't think to ask. Gene asked for Wendell Kraft's phone number. Dale wrote it on a scrap of insulation sheathing, the pink fiberglass kind, in pencil. Gene put it in his shirt pocket and drove back to the farm. That evening, he sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and did arithmetic on the back of the seed corn receipt from the co-op. He estimated the large flat-faced pieces at 160 to 200 tons. Smaller rounded material, if it was usable at all, added another 40 to 60 tons. Chester County quarry price was $68 per ton at the source. He wrote $8,000 at the bottom of the receipt, then wrote $15,000 above it as a ceiling. He tucked the receipt under the legal pad. The next morning he went back into the east field with a piece of chalk. He worked for 3 hours, walking row to row, marking only the stones that had at least one flat, usable face. He marked 94 before the chalk ran down to nothing. He found a second piece in the coffee can on the equipment shed workbench and finished the field. The final count, marked and tallied, was 137 flat-faced pieces out of the 140 large stones. The remaining 3 were too rounded for wall work. He called Wendell Kraft that afternoon. Kraft came out the following week, on a Tuesday in the 3rd week of April. He came in a 1984 Chevy pickup with the company name on the door in block letters. The blue paint faded at the edges. He shook Gene's hand at the equipment shed, and they walked the east field together without hurrying. Kraft moved slowly. He stopped at individual stones and crouched to look at them from a low angle. He picked up smaller pieces and turned them over in his hands, pressing his thumb along the surface grain. He examined the layering and the color variation that came from decades of exposure to rain and freeze cycles. He had the quiet manner of a man who already knew what he was looking at, but wanted to confirm the count. He told Gene the material was better than what he typically sourced from the Chester County Quarry for face applications. Quarried stone came out clean cut, but it looked new. Didn't have the coloring or the surface variation that naturally heaved fieldstone carried. He had accounts in the new residential developments east of Reading, where clients specifically wanted stone that looked aged and permanent. Local fieldstone weathered into a house differently. Looked like it had always been part of the ground. Then, Kraft asked what Gene had been planning to do with the rocks otherwise. Gene told him about Lloyd Metzger, said it usually ran 2 or 3 hauls at $800 each to clear the field each spring, sometimes 4, in a year like this one. Kraft looked out at the field for a moment. Then he asked Gene what fair value would be for access to everything on the 40 acres, large and small, all material included. Gene said $12,000. That would cover everything. Access through the south gate, and Gene's time pre-sorting the flat-faced pieces into a staging area near the road. Kraft said he'd check his job schedule and call back. He called back the next morning. The answer was yes. Gene spent the first 9 days of May sorting stones. He worked alone with the International Harvester 560 loader tractor he'd bought used in 1974 from a retiring farmer south of Kutztown. The tractor was a 1961 model, 26 years old that spring, with a sound like a deep cough at startup that cleared out after 2 minutes of running. The hydraulics on the front loader were solid, and the bucket still lifted without drift. He moved the large flat-faced stones to a staging area near the south gate, a 30 by 40-foot patch of packed earth he'd leveled with a box blade the previous fall. He stacked the flat pieces in rows, each row 2 feet high, loosely sorted by approximate thickness. He left the rounded, smaller material where it lay in the field, to be loaded by Kraft's crew directly. He worked from 7 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon each day. On the second day, he found a hairline crack running across the front bucket's left mounting pin. He drove the tractor north on Route 737 to Stump's Farm Equipment in Shoemakersville, 11 miles out, and had a replacement pin pressed in by early afternoon. The part cost $14. He was back on the field by 2 o'clock. On the 9th day, he lifted the last large flat piece from the far corner near the creek and set it into the staging rows. He shut the tractor down and walked back across the field in the late afternoon. The air was cooler near the tree line, carrying the damp smell of the creek below. The surface of the field was rough and scraped where the loader had worked close to the soil. The gray granite block that had stood at the center of the field for weeks was gone, loaded into the staging area on the 3rd day. The field felt open in a way that was hard to describe, but easy to notice. Kraft's first truck arrived on May 14th. A Mack flatbed with a crane arm, driven by 2 men from the Fleetwood yard. They loaded 8 tons from the staging rows on the first run. Came back that same afternoon and took 6 more. They were back at 7:30 the following morning, the truck's diesel sound carrying across the field before Gene could see it from the equipment shed window. By May 22nd, Kraft's crew had completed 9 trips. The staging rows were gone. The crew moved into the field and began loading the smaller rounded material, garden edging stock, pathway fill, material that would go into jobs where the irregular shape worked in its favor. The crane arm couldn't grip pieces embedded at deep angles below the surface. A third man from Kraft's yard worked those sections by hand, rolling stones along the ground to where the crane could reach them. The last truck left on May 28th. Gene walked the east field after they were gone. He covered the full 40 acres in 45 minutes. He found 11 stones remaining, all of them tilted too deep for the crane to grip without excavating. He wrote their locations down on the yellow legal pad beside the stone count from March. The rest of the field was clear. Clearest it had been in 28 years. Walt Dressel came by the following week to return a come-along he'd borrowed the previous September. He found Gene sitting on the equipment shed steps. He asked about all the truck traffic he'd seen on the county road. Said he'd counted 9 loads or more pulling out of Gene's south gate over the span of 2 weeks. Gene told him. Kraft Stone and Masonry. $12,000 for the stones. Walt looked at the east field. Clean ground, last of the mud drying in the low spots. Then he looked back at Gene. He asked how many hauls Lloyd Metzger would have charged for that same volume. Gene said 3 hauls, maybe 4, given the winter. Walt stood there for another moment without speaking. Then he picked up the come-along and walked back around to his truck. Kraft's check arrived on June 3rd. It was drawn on First National Community Bank in Fleetwood, Pennsylvania. Gene deposited it at his Kutztown branch the following morning. The teller, a woman named Ruth Seidel, who had handled his farm account for 6 years, looked at the deposit amount twice before stamping the slip. He planted seed corn in the east field the week after the deposit. Ran the 4-row planter the full length of the field, north to south, from the shed lane to the tree line near Weiss Creek. The International Harvester pulled it clean across all 40 acres without a single stone contact. First time in 28 years of planting that stretch that the equipment had run the whole run without interruption. He wrote the date on the yellow legal pad below the stone count from March and the haul dates from May. Clyde Furman from the County Agricultural Extension Office came by in late June. He was doing routine follow-up visits on soil test results. Gene's east field had shown low magnesium the previous fall, and Furman wanted to document the response to the amendment. They walked the field together. Furman saw the cleared ground. The corn already 4 inches tall in even rows, no stone breaking the surface across the entire 40 acres. He asked what Gene had done with the rocks. Gene told him about Kraft. Furman drove to the end of the lane and stopped. Then backed up and came around to where Gene was standing. He said he had 2 other farmers in the Eastern District with similar rocky ground who had been paying Lloyd Metzger for years. He wanted Wendell Kraft's phone number. Gene gave it to him. Kraft called again in August. He had 2 new job sites starting in the fall. A custom home in Bern Township and a commercial facade project on a parcel at the edge of Reading. He asked if Gene would give him first call on whatever the east field produced the following spring. They worked out the terms over 2 phone calls. Kraft would pay $55 per ton for flat-faced material pre-sorted and staged near the south gate. Smaller rounded material would go at $28 per ton in the field. Gene would sort. Kraft's crew would haul. March 1988. The thaw came again. The rocks came with it. Lighter than the previous year, the winter of 1987 to 1988 had been milder, the frost not as deep, the heave not as severe. Gene walked the field on March 19th and counted 78 large stones. He called Kraft that afternoon. Kraft's crew came out in April. 4 loads. Gene received $4,200. In 1989, the field ran lighter. 2 loads, $1,100. In 1990, the frost went in hard again. 6 loads came out through April and May. Gene received $3,400. The arrangement continued for 7 years. Gene kept the records on the yellow legal pad, adding a new page each spring. Stone count, haul dates, tonnage, payment from craft stone and masonry. By the end of the 1994 season, the 7th year, the cumulative total from the Eastfield was $31,400. He had spent $14 on a tractor bucket pin. Wendell Craft operated his company until 1999. He retired at 67, having built the business from a 2-man masonry operation in 1971 to a 14-employee firm with steady residential and commercial accounts across Berks County and into the edge of Montgomery County to the south. His son Dale, the same man Gene had first spoken to at the Route 100 job site in the spring of 1987, took over the company and kept the standing arrangement with Gene. The Eastfield was producing less each season by then, the deep reservoir of frost-heaved stone diminishing as the years passed. But it had not stopped entirely. Walt Dressel called Wendell Craft's office in the fall of 1987. His North Field had been generating heavy stone for more than a decade. He'd paid Lloyd Metzger for most of it. He told Gene about his first Craft arrangement the following spring at the co-op in Kutztown. Said his first haul brought him $2,800. 3 other farmers in the eastern part of the county made similar arrangements with Craft Stone within 2 years of Gene's first deal. No announcements. No extension service publications. Word moved through fence line conversations and grain elevator parking lot talk, through the co-op bulletin board at Kutztown, through the same informal channels that had carried Lloyd Metzger's phone number for 15 years. Clyde Furman mentioned it in a single paragraph in the 1988 Extension District newsletter. Said some farmers in the county had begun exploring sale arrangements for cleared fieldstone with local masonry contractors. No names. No dollar figures. The paragraph ran between a section on soil magnesium programs and a section on early blight management in the tomato crop. Lloyd Metzger's operation in Maxatony Township ran through the 1990s. He diversified into grading work and light excavation as the stone haul requests slowed from the farms with the heaviest ground. His dump spread outside of town stopped growing as fast as it had in the early 1980s. Gene Harmon farmed the Eastfield through the 2001 season. He sold the property that fall. He was 76. And the ground had grown harder to work than it had been, to a couple from Phoenixville who wanted land for a small market vegetable operation. They asked Gene what to expect from the Eastfield in terms of maintenance. He brought the yellow legal pads out to the kitchen table. There were 4 of them by then, filled front and back, held together with a rubber band. He went through them season by season with the new owners. Stone counts from March of each year, haul dates, tonnage estimates, payment amounts received from Craft Stone and masonry. 28 springs of farming the field first, then 15 springs of selling what the field produced. He told them to call Dale Craft when the March thaw came, said to walk the field first and mark the flat-faced pieces separately. Said not to call Lloyd Metzger. The new owners kept the legal pads in the kitchen drawer where Gene had left them. They called Dale Craft the following spring, made their first arrangement. Gene heard about it through Walt Dressel, who still farmed the ground on the far side of Weiss Creek. Gene drove past the property once in 2006. He was coming back from a hardware run in Kutztown and went the long way on the county road without planning to. The Eastfield had a row crop in it. Garlic, it looked like from the road, rows running straight north to south from the shed lane down to the tree line near Weiss Creek. No stone showing above the surface. The south gate was open. The staging area behind it sat flat and empty. The ground there still a little firmer than the surrounding field from years of loaded trucks turning around on it. He slowed, but did not stop. drove on toward home. The stones from the east field are in walls and facings and retaining structures across eastern Berks County. Some are in a foundation facing on a custom home in Byrne Township. Gray and rust-colored schist laid flat against a poured wall. The same layering that showed in the afternoon light back in the spring of 1987. Some are in a low garden border east of Reading. Some are in a commercial facade that went up in the fall of 1988 on a parcel between Kutztown and the county line, weathered limestone and granite, set in mortar, looking like they have always been part of whatever they're built into. Because in a way, they have. The yellow legal pad stayed in the kitchen drawer of the farmhouse on Weiss Creek Road. 4 pads, rubber band around them, front and back filled in the same hand from 1987 to 2001. Stone counts from every March. Payments received every spring, starting with the number 140, written on the morning of March 17, 1987, beside a cold cup of coffee. Still in the drawer. Still there.